Hello, my friends. I am here. I am back. I am alive despite my COVID and that I gave it to you. It seems like even those who got it had a good time at Pod Jam. Thank you for joining me at the Hangout last night to recap it all. Very excited to have, I think you're going to love my guest today. She's joining me for the first time. She's a cultural anthropologist, brilliant woman, and author of several books. Her new book is Exit Wounds: How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border, and that is what we are talking about on today's episode of Stand Up. I still am not doing the news segment until next week because I am obviously not feeling great and my voice is awful and I'm coughing and sniffling, and I just don't think anybody really wants to hear that. You're probably already sick of it, but I promise to get back to the regular format of the show that you expect starting on Monday. Also going to continue to recap and talk about Pod Jam, though I don't want to leave people out who didn't go and don't care about it. But I just want to say this one thing that a friend of mine from high school that I grew up with, kind of an outsider to the group, but not really. He's a longtime listener and a fly on the wall at some of our hangouts. Shout out to Brian Castor, who was at Pod Jam and said he was explaining to his girlfriend what I'm all about, what the podcast is all about, and our community, and said it's a community of people looking to understand and make the world a little better with each other. And I love that. Thank you, Brian, and thank you to everybody who has been writing me amazing messages. They just keep on coming, so the high is not fading for me, and I hope it's not for you, despite the illness that some of us have. I will have much more to say, but for now, I did want to share this interview with you. It's a really important issue and guest, and that is the core of what I have been doing my entire career in broadcasting, talking to smart people about important issues that impact our world, our community, and our lives. And today's guest is certainly no exception to that. I simply think it's fascinating what she does for a living: ethnography and cultural anthropology, embedding into different communities and cultures and reporting on them. Such a good book, an important book. I hope that you like it. So without further ado, welcome to Stand Up, Ieva Jusionyte, Exit Wounds: How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border. We have a big deal academic who is also a practitioner of many sorts. So excited to meet you, Ieva. Welcome to the show, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
What an interesting, first, just about you, if you don't mind, a little bit about you and your work and the field that you're in. What is anthropology? How did you get into this fascinating career? As I've read and interviewed anthropologists in the past, I've thought, yeah, man, I bet you I could have done that in some life. It seems so fascinating. I don't think I'm smart enough. But what is it, and how did you get into it?
Oh, I love anthropology. I think it is the most universal science about what it is to be human. So there are anthropologists who are more archaeologists, and they dig up the ruins and learn about how people lived in the past. I am not that kind of anthropologist. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. So I study contemporary societies and cross-cultural topics. Unfortunately, my topics are not so interesting as food or dress or housing, but have to do with state violence and borders and guns. But I became an anthropologist after I got bored by being a political scientist. I studied political science in college, and I just didn't like learning from polling data and all these models. I wanted to get out there and talk to the people and learn through this embedded and embodied experience, which is ethnography, about various issues faced by humans.
Now, you said another word that needs some defining: ethnography. Talk about that in terms of the ethnography that you've conducted.
I've done a few ethnographic studies. So this one in particular was about guns and what guns mean to people in the United States and in Mexico. But ethnography means that you are hanging out with people. It's deep hanging out. It's doing interviews, but it's also spending time with the people you're interviewing throughout the day as they go about their everyday lives, as they pick up their kids from school, and as they go to drink in the evening, living in their everyday context in order to understand them as more fully human than just what they tell you in interviews, which can be partially true.
Yes, it's fascinating. I want to do that. Can you do that without a degree? Because I love the idea that you go into a community, embed in a community, and try to find out all of the nuances, the granularity of their life, and the social problems that they have, and that you can't find out through a more traditional or academic study, I guess. That's what it sounds like.
It is. And a lot of journalists do something very similar to ethnography. They just don't have that much time to spend with people. Ethnographers, we can spend years with the community. That helps. And then we have various theories through which we try to analyze what we're learning, which, you might need to go to school for that.
That's in my past. We'll rely on you. And I'm so happy that you're here to talk about this work that you've done. Talk to me about how and why you became an EMT, because that was your last book.
That was my last book. I first became a volunteer firefighter because I did this documentary film about firefighters back in Argentina. Long story. But today, being a firefighter, a lot of the calls we get are not for fires, but for medical calls. So I decided I want to know how to do that. I became an EMT and then a paramedic. And then I worked in Massachusetts and then in Florida. And then I did research on U.S. Mexico border as a volunteer EMT.
Now, just help me clear up the timing of that. You did that while you were practicing as an academic, as an anthropologist, et cetera.
Oh, yes, but I didn't tell my colleagues that I was missing faculty meetings because I had to be on shift in the ambulance. Yeah,
that's what I couldn't figure out. I don't know how you can have this dual life, that you're in one part of your life, you're doing that job, and another part of your life, you're this highbrow elitist academic.
I think it made me really I am taking academia very seriously.
Sure.
Please don't misunderstand me, but it put everything into perspective when you see kind of people getting into car accidents every day and then some other departmental, I don't know whether I can use bad words on the show. So just like mess.
Yeah. Shitstorm?
Yeah, something like that.
How did that work and your last book lead to this new book, Exit Wounds? Connect the dots for us.
So I was in southern Arizona and northern Sonora, Mexico. I was volunteering with firefighters and EMTs, and we were meeting a lot of migrants and asylum seekers who were already wary by the time they reached the border. Some of them had various injuries along the way. Others got injured when crossing the border. And then I began asking questions. So what is this violence that these people are coming from, that they are risking their lives to get into our country? And that made me realize that our guns, American guns, are causing a lot of this violence, because when you cross the border, you see all these signs that say guns and ammunition illegal in Mexico. And I didn't know that Mexico has very different gun laws compared to the United States before I started this. I didn't know that most of the guns in Mexico come from the United States, that they are trafficked. So seeing those people coming north, I decided, it makes sense to follow the guns south and see this connection.
For sure. It's not something that we didn't know was happening, obviously, but the fact that you really put in all this work and research is why this book, I think, is so important, especially in the way that you wrote it and did it. Talk to me about borders themselves, because I think it's easy for Americans and people who haven't left America, which is a lot of us, to look at even our neighbors and blame them for whatever their problems are. But if you just take a step back and you think about what a border is, if I polluted the water or the air and it went into Mexico or Canada, it wouldn't be their fault. It would be my fault. And it seems like the same is true of all things, all issues when it comes to borders. No matter what policy we have, it is going to affect certainly the states, the countries closest to us, much less it's easy to connect things that we do here in America to Central and South America, much less Europe and Asia. It's all connected, more globalized than ever before, obviously. But when it comes to Mexico and guns and drugs and even economic and other policies, obviously, it's very connected. But it's so easy for us Americans who know nothing about Mexico, except for a few things that we know, not always good, not always bad, but to just assume it's their fault, Ieva. It's their fault, that their violence, if they would just be more sophisticated and more, I don't know, if they would work harder and all these other negative stereotypes. But the truth is, it's very connected. That's hopefully the most I'll talk. But it seems like people don't realize that. What about borders, and what do they not mean or mean when it comes to this?
Oh, borders. So borders are artificial. Like you are completely right. Like we put them there and then we say we control what's on this side of the border and not what on another. And then we make these decisions. Oh, we want the free movement of goods, and maybe we want the free movement of capital, but definitely not the free movement of people. So that creates the migration crisis. But then when you're thinking about what is legal on one side of the border and what is illegal on the other side of the border, that kind of creates supply and demand. So we want drugs. Somebody has to supply those drugs, unfortunately, for us, and they come through Mexico. And those groups that are supplying us the drugs, they need to compete for these routes through which they supply the drugs. So they need the guns, which they can't get there. But, oh, look, on the other side of the border, we have tens of thousands of gun stores and all the kinds of guns you want to have. So borders are an illusion that we can circumscribe these problems and solutions just within one country, and then project all our fears and all our discontent with how things are happening in this country, about the economy, about what have you, onto people on the other side.
Oh yeah, we're experts at that. We make a lot of money doing that. We sell a lot of fear doing that. Talk to me. You mentioned the gun laws are different in Mexico than they are here. And that I assume you mean they have gun laws as opposed to the Wild West that is America.
America is not all the same. I live in Massachusetts. We actually have quite a few gun laws, but
borders. But back to the point about borders, you're absolutely right. Massachusetts, my state has good gun laws, but guess what? The state next to mine might not.
Exactly. New Hampshire is just across the border, right, 1 hour away from us. So
live free or die.
Live free or die, yeah, and take our guns.
Yeah.
Mexico passed, they didn't have very strict gun laws, although their constitution permits everyone to have a gun, but also says that the law will determine which guns will be prohibited. And then they passed this law in the 1970s that basically allows people to have only up to 10 guns, only one handgun, and up to 10 maybe rifles or shotguns if you are a hunter or belong to a hunting club. And then they limit what kind of calibers you can have. They limit how much ammunition you can buy in a month. So it's difficult to get a gun permit. Almost nobody has carry permits. So it's very limited. And I don't know, I don't think I need to remind people what laws we have in this country and what kind of right, guns you can have here.
Yes. I think people who don't even pay attention know because they're so ever present in our lives. It seems like we've all become experts. The primary narrative here in your book, or rather in our country, and we just talked about this, is that people and drugs moving across the border. But you show that you talk about the southbound flow of guns and this horrific consequences of that pipeline. Talk to me about what it is and how it works and what you saw.
Yeah, even from ATF or the government would know that guns are going south. But for me, it was important to understand like how they get there and who are these people who are both taking the guns across and where do they end up. In a lot of these guns are sold in gun stores or sometimes like through online kind of meetups and parking lots in front of Walmarts. But the people who buy the guns are most usually U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So people who are legally allowed to buy guns. They give the guns to somebody else who is the smuggler. Sometimes there are a couple smugglers, somebody who takes the gun to the border and a different person who takes it across the border. Guns are hidden in hidden compartments in cars and extra fuel tanks under sheetrock or construction materials, and they cross through the ports of entry. They don't go across the river or through the desert. They go the same way that drugs get into this country, mostly like with our produce and watermelons and all of that.
Right.
Yeah. And then they go to both organized crime groups and they go to people who want the kinds of guns that they don't have and have the means to get them.
Is it easier to get anything into Mexico than it is into America, or do they have the same?
Oh, no, the odds are in their favor. If you go to Mexico, outbound lanes are almost very rarely checked by Customs and Border Protection. The agents sometimes stand at the kind of border crossings and they watch cars. If something is suspicious, they might stop you, or if they get a heads up that somebody just bought a ton of guns, they might stop that person. And in Mexico, you press this button. If the light is red, you might go to secondary inspection. If it's green, you go through. to get into the United States, you sometimes have to wait for hours. You need to show your documents. There are dogs and they check your car for drugs. So it does take, the U.S. government focuses all of its resources and manpower on checking what's getting into the country and not what's getting out of the country, as if these two were not connected.
I should have asked you before I hit record if you would read anything from it. I don't know if you have anything prepared that you would want to read, because it's so visceral. And sometimes when you're interviewing an author who writes the way that you write, it's not as good to just talk about it as it is to maybe just read it. Do you have any passage that you would want to read?
No, sure. I can read from the beginning.
Yeah, I was thinking of Shape of Wounds. Obviously, we've already talked about your work as an EMT, and I think that this can help maybe listeners and readers understand why we should care about what is happening there. And not much does that more justice, I feel like, than the beginning of your book, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. Okay. I can read from the beginning of Shape of Wounds.
Great.
Before I saw the guns, I saw the wounds. The young man sat on the bench in front of me, and after looking around to make sure nobody else was listening, leaned closer. His voice, barely louder than a whisper, blended in with the hum of a large industrial fan pushing hot desert air around the building with makeshift walls and corrugated metal roof. He said his name was Raul and that he was from Acapulco, the resort city on Guerrero's Pacific coast. He fled after men wearing balaclavas forced his father into a truck and then dumped his decapitated body onto the street. He said he had HIV and had run out of antiretrovirals. I met Raul and many others, men, women, children, Mexican, Salvadoran, Honduran, at the AIDS Center for Migrants, steps away from the U.S. border in Nogales, Sonora, where I was providing basic medical care as a volunteer. They came with blisters on their feet, infected wounds, fever, without their insulin or other medications, trying to outpace fear and not lose hope along the way. That was 8 years ago, before President Trump ordered miles of new walls to be built, before the COVID-19 pandemic and Title 42, before I cared to know the difference between 9mm and 7.62. When in the summer of 2022 I returned to Nogales, the medical clinic had moved to a separate room with floor-to-ceiling cabinets full of supplies at the new spacious migrant center across the street from the old one. Alejandra was sitting on the chair by the closed door while I poured red gooey Tylenol syrup into plastic cups and handed them to each of her 3 small children. Threats started coming, she said, sharing tiny pieces of her story. This family, like Raul's years earlier, had come from Guerrero, and so did many others I spoke to that day. They were farmers and taxi drivers, cooks and craftsmen who had fled their home when they could no longer pay extortion fees, when gunmen came to take away their cattle, burn their mango orchards, when the neighbors and relatives were killed or disappeared. There is no law, Alejandra said. There was nowhere they could turn to for protection. Some had tried, went to the police, only to start receiving threats from them too. So they packed what they could carry and headed toward the U.S. border. Not everyone talked about the reasons why they were fleeing Mexico. At the clinic, we didn't ask them to say more about themselves than what they wanted, focusing instead on what little we could do for them. But they didn't even have to say anything. Their bodies, exhausted, dehydrated, marked by scars, were evidence that something back home had gone seriously awry for them to risk their lives on the journey north.
It's fascinating. I think that anybody listening to your reading will get a now good look at how you wrote this and how you reported this, really. It's great writing and it's heart-wrenching, but riveting. I can't put it down. It's absolutely fascinating. Say a little bit more about what readers will learn and the way that you did this, because it's segmented into chapters where you follow different people, different lives. Talk a little bit more about them. Pick one if you want, but how you did it.
Yeah, so the book follows one of the main characters in the book is this young woman, Samara, who was recruited to work for organized crime when she was 13 after her parents left and relocated to Texas, and she stayed alone in Mexico. Another person is this businessman in the same city that Samara grew up in, but he is from the wealthy part of the city, and he started to get into guns because he wanted to get guns to protect himself from organized crime groups, the kinds that Samara was part of. Then I follow a journalist who covers organized crime. We travel through some parts of the country where it was safer for me to go with him and him to go with me. And on the U.S. side of the border, the story follows these two U.S. federal agents from ATF and Homeland Security investigations, how they are trying to stop guns from getting into Mexico after some really horribly failed operations that allowed U.S. guns to get into Mexico.
Yeah. Say more about what you learned about that federal agency. I don't know much, but it does seem, to me, it seems like a necessary agency, ATF, and what they do and what their role is. And maybe you disagree. I have no idea and I have no real opinion, but alcohol, tobacco, firearms and the work they do. And maybe they do it wrong. Maybe it's insidious in any number of ways that the federal government can be. But I feel like I want them there. I knew a friend who was undercover as an ATF agent for years. He did great work infiltrating white supremacist gangs. And I also know that they would at least seem extremely underfunded. Like they have 1,000 agents or something to cover, I don't know, millions of people or something. That's all I've got to say about ATF. What is your view on the necessity, the role, their actual performance, and the rest?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. So one of the reasons I wanted to include this kind of one of the narratives to be of the agents, because I do think that they're doing very important work with very limited resources. In the borderlands, they often pair up with agents from other agencies, so from Department of Homeland Security, for example, right, that are much better funded, and then they can do gun trafficking investigations together. But they are, first of all, ATF doesn't want a lot of their work to be very public because every time there is a big backlash against what they do, and their funding only gets slashed when they do this really important work of checking gun dealers of whether they follow the laws.
Right. So explain just the kind of politics of that, because when you say ATF is less well funded than DHS, they're not under the same. Does ATF is under DHS?
No, ATF is under DOJ. They are under Department of Justice.
So DHS is an agency, a giant agency created with a huge budget after 9/11, of course, by the Bush administration. But my understanding, what I'm hearing you're saying, what I think I've understood for a long time, is the ATF has always been the black sheep from the conservative point of view, certainly in America, from the pro-gun, at least, point of view, because their job is to crack down on illegal gun sales, etc. And Republicans don't want there to be police on that beat. How am I doing?
Exactly. And that's why when about a decade ago, some agents made some wrong decisions, trying to see if they let the guns go across the border, where they would lead them to which organized crime groups, and they get lost track of those guns. So the fast and furious operations that the Republicans then took to say, maybe this is just a conspiracy theory, that this is to control, this whole operation was in order to impose more gun controls.
It's every police department in America and around the world does that kind of a thing. They put something out and they follow it. Is that not standard?
They do, but what the problem is, they didn't follow. They let the guns go. They let them cross the border. They didn't follow. So now the agents who I worked with and whose story I'm telling, they don't let those guns get out of their eyesight, which is the standard practice, what they do in this country. But then they made mistakes in the past where they didn't follow those guns.
Right. And so once a mistake, a highly publicized mistake happens to a federal agency, it can lose funding. It gets politicized, which is why, I don't know, NASA stopped flying the space shuttle. Seriously, they lost funding after it blew up. You can't make a mistake in the federal government the way you can in the private sector because your budget gets cut. I don't know if that makes sense, but it seems to be the case. And that's what happened with ATF. It sounds like you're saying as a result of that operation going awry.
Yeah, very much. And so under the Department of Justice, the other big agency, which is not the ATF, is the DEA. And the DEA is also one of the best funded agencies. But this is also the priorities. Our government kind of war on drugs is the priority, and gun control, if we can do, only if we do it quietly so we don't upset the public.
Got it. I think that background is really important to what is happening in Mexico and why it's happening. And now, I've got to ask you, of course, in the run up to this upcoming election, we hear so much about border security, but we hear so much about needing to stop migrants and the invasion. And obviously, we hear a lot about fentanyl coming across the southern border. We aren't hearing as much about guns, obviously. We don't talk as much about addiction. But what do you think that we need to have a better understanding than this really ridiculous, simplistic demagoguing of the issue that we constantly hear from politicians and pundits?
We hear it because it works. It actually wins
elections. Oh, yeah, no doubt.
And it's been like that for decades. So this is like nothing new. The types of drugs people are addicted to in the United States for different reasons change. So now it is fentanyl, unfortunately. And the Mexican government is trying to put this on the agenda through their lawsuits now against U.S. gun manufacturers and gun dealers in Arizona. So I think we are now talking more about the kind of what the guns are doing. But unfortunately, even now when both presidential candidates went to the border in Texas a few weeks ago, they focused on migration and they focused on securing the border and maybe drugs, but none of them mentioned guns at all, or that Texas is the main place from which like 43% of all guns recovered in crime scenes in Mexico between 2017 and 2021, 43%, that's almost half of all the guns, came from Texas. And Texas is the state where the governor kind of really emphasizes that we need to control the border, but control the border only northbound and not making the link that the Texas guns are actually what makes both the drugs and the people appear at the border to an extent. Yeah.
Such an important point. How serious is the fentanyl thing, do you think?
The fentanyl thing is serious, but it's not. The solution is to address the addiction epidemic in the United States. As long as there is demand, there will always be supply, no matter which border we think or internal places that will make it. So it's not, can't seal ourselves off from, unfortunately.
When it comes to guns in Mexico, how does the Mexican public generally view the problem? Do they realize, probably a lot of Americans don't, obviously, because Americans don't care about anywhere outside their own town, but do Mexicans understand does the Mexican public understand that the guns come from America? Are there red, white, and blue flags on all these guns?
Not usually, not the flags, but Colt, Smith & Wesson, like the brands themselves, like made in America. You don't need the flag. Right. Some people are really upset at the United States for these big kind of and failed operations where U.S. guns got lost in Mexico. But we're talking about several thousand guns. There is much less kind of understanding or appreciation that guns used by most organized crime are also coming from the United States. I think it is just not something people want to talk about. And in many parts of the country, people don't want to talk about organized crime at all because it is just a dangerous subject.
Yes, including journalists.
Exactly.
You write about one journalist. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I talked to a lot of journalists, but then one of them that became a more central figure in the book who has been covering organized crime for over a decade and received threats from various groups in the northeast of Mexico. And he is under government protection program. And he was writing a book about this big massacre that the Zetas conducted in collaboration with local police.
The Zetas.
Yes, the Zetas.
And in case people don't know who that is, the organized crime group.
Yeah, the really bad one that was formed by former military men in Mexico, kind of military deserters. So we with him went to northern Mexico, to these towns where people still don't want to talk about this collusion between organized crime and local police and the military, and try to talk to the victims and survivors and hear their stories. And that happened more than a decade ago, the massacres, and people are still afraid to talk about it.
Crazy to imagine thinking about not even being able to talk about a horrible thing that happened. A horrible thing happens. It's all we do is talk about it. But you're afraid to talk about it for fear that it could happen again. You're not supposed to. They don't, right? Keep quiet or you'll be gone, it would seem.
Keep quiet, be safe.
So you also, in the beginning of the book, you do a great job in this chapter called Arming the State to give us a history lesson. Could you give me a little bit about why that was important for the book and about it itself, history?
I think we can't really understand anything without history. So one, like U.S. and Mexico, neighboring countries, like how did we come to have such different attitude and legal regimes as pertaining to guns? So I wanted to figure that out. And I went all the way back to 18th century and 19th century when U.S. and Mexico were formed. And Mexico never had an arms industry, so most of the guns they used even to fight for independence against Spain, or later for the Mexican Revolution, or to even before that, 19th century, to repel the invasion or fight against the United States when U.S. invaded Mexico and took like almost half of its territory. All of those battles were fought with foreign guns, European guns, and more recently, American guns. So and for Mexico itself, it was like a big question for some of the leaders 100 years ago. Like, how can we be dependent on getting these tools that we need to protect our own sovereignty from abroad? Like, why are we not producing them? But then they never really developed such a powerful industry, and therefore they don't have such a powerful gun lobby as the United States. And maybe that is one of the reasons, even though they created more strict gun laws than the United States, it's just impossible to isolate itself from this very powerful armed northern neighbor.
It's so important to understand that. You're absolutely right. And people are going to have to read the book to learn more because it puts so much texture and color to this issue. Short of existing U.S. gun laws changing the gun laws, it doesn't seem like this issue is going to abate in Mexico, much less the violence in America. Is there anything else that Mexican people or government can do to prevent or slow the flow of guns south if we don't do anything but give them to everybody?
That's a good and difficult question. So in the end of the book, because my editors really insisted, I do make some suggestions of what we could do, but I don't think that this is a solution that will show results in the next couple of years. It took us a very long time to get into this, and it will take us a long time and kind of very complex issues. One of them, treating drug addiction in the United States. Like, what does that have to do with gun trafficking? A lot. In Mexico, we need to build the criminal justice system and people's trust in local security and police. Do that. But also other things, like any small modifications we could do to our gun policies in the United States, such as having smart technology, like to open your smartphone, you use a thumb or a face scan.
Right.
It would be very easy to make guns that are only firing when the proper owner has them. And that would reduce like domestic violence, that would reduce the appeal of guns for thieves and so as well for traffickers. So we don't necessarily have to change the Second Amendment in order to take such smart measures.
Yeah, I talked to all these gun organizations, gun control or violence organizations, and I hear a lot of these policies, but it just seems so daunting to get them passed at the national level. Like you said, Massachusetts and New York, I always want to talk about the change that occurs at the state and local level as a result of, frankly, grassroots activism. All these organizations, the big change needs to happen at the national level, at the federal level. And it seems that even if we were able to get it through Congress, you got to wonder what would happen with our Supreme Court, who probably has guns under their robes, at least 5 of them.
Yeah, not a good prospect with the Supreme Court today.
Yeah, but we will see what happens tomorrow. And your book is, and your work is so, doing what you do, you look at all the, as you mentioned, complexities, but we water everything down to a meme that will fit on a graphic that I can post on Facebook to convince the members of my tribe that Biden, Democrats this, Republicans that, blue versus red, including when it comes to guns and everything else. Here at the end of our conversation, what do you want to say about how complex these issues are and why we should be caring about them as Americans, the violence in Mexico?
Ooh, that's a tall order.
It's a moral, I know, I realize it's a moral question, but I think the audience of this show at least wants to know why we care about things. We care about other people that we don't know. And we certainly care about the people whose lives we may be indirectly affecting in a negative or positive way. So I realize it's a moral question, but I still will ask it.
I appreciate that it's a moral question. I don't think we can find our way out of this through just laws, because as long as people's morals and whatever the laws are don't coincide, that won't really change anything. Right. So I think it is for one thing, even our self-interest in order not to create almost civil war and really bad insecurity and violence abroad, so that then we have to care for all these people who don't want to leave their home. They don't want to come and ask here for asylum. So if we could do that, but also think about what are the consequences of our gun policies and maybe not enough oversight of the gun industry, that is not like that, the effects that are not just within our borders, which are really terrifying even here, but that they affect the whole world. And we are flooding the world with guns because we have more guns than people in this country. And I think it is a responsible citizens should stop and ask whether this is really what even the drafters of the Second Amendment, this is not what they intended.
Such good points and such important work. I hope that people will get the book. It's fascinating. It's super important. Exit Wounds, How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border. Ieva, congratulations on all of your work and this book. It's great to get the opportunity to talk to you. I'm very honored and I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can do it again.
Thank you so much.
All right, there she goes. Ieva Jusionyte. I hope that you get the book, Exit Wounds, How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border, and let her know that you heard her here on the program. Always appreciated. Write a review of the show on iTunes or Spotify. Sign up if you're not already a subscriber and join our community on Discord and, of course, at our Thursday night hangouts. All right, well, we'll see if I drop any more tomorrow or the next day. I might not, but I am getting better and looking forward to returning to the regular format of the show starting Monday. Thanks again, everybody. As always, love you. John Carroll taking us out.
Trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels been leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense and you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of the stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand